So my guest today is Jan de Visch, and he has recently written a book called Dynamic Collaboration, Strengthening Self-Organization and Collaborative Intelligence in Teams. He's a professor of human capital management in Belgium, and he's a consultant at Connect and Transform. So Jan, can you give me an outline of what your book's about and how you came to write this?
Well, the start of my book, in fact, was in my experience with teams in companies. I went through many transition trajectories with my clients. And what I often saw was that what we agreed upon was not implemented. And a lot of teams come back to agreements they often make with each other. And I was very puzzled and wondered how did that come? And well, I tried to find solutions in the competency, in the competency domain by looking at, for example, how can we meet better? How can we follow up on agreements? How can we better plan and organize? But for one reason or another, priority management, delegation, planning and organization, all those competencies did not work very well. And when I met Otto Lasker, with which I wrote the book in 2006, it's now about 12 years ago, well, he pointed to another dimension, the fact that people differ in developmental level. And that means that they differ in the way they interpret reality. And in that interpretation is the seed for either an intelligent way of collaborating, in which you follow up, in which you contribute to something much more than yourself, which I call an upward dynamic, or in a downward dynamic, which means that you narrow challenges, you do not follow up on agreements, and you start questioning over and over again what has been discussed. So, well, I was already pointed by some colleagues from the Global Requisite Society to the fact that people differ developmentally, but Requisite Society, for one reason or another, never applied that insight to the working of teams. So that's how I came to write the book. Is, well, what is really the essence in creating collaborative intelligence, and creating collaborative intelligence becomes more and more important in the Industry 4.0 developments, in which our world becomes more and more complex, ambiguous, volatile, and so on. And so people really need to find a different way of collaborating. And so I started, well, reflecting upon how can I translate insights from research in the cognitive developmental field into organizations. And that was the start of the book.
Very interesting. One of the ways I describe sort of the consulting I do is that there's 4 quadrants. So you can think vertically that there's the dimension between the individual and group, and then horizontally it's internal and external.
Yes.
And so if you're looking at competence, which is the external of an individual, what are the skills that you're manifesting? And so you can look at running meetings better and doing things like that. That really what you're saying is you have to move to the internal developmental side of an individual. So what stage are they at developmentally in order to contribute to the book? And I think that's a very good distinction.
That's correct. And that's almost everywhere absent in approach to change and transformation.
Well, and one of the things that I quite liked was because I watched a webinar on your book not too long ago, and you talked about the Industry 4.0 and the need for responsiveness to change. And I thought the changes were quite, they resonated a lot with me in terms of what I'm seeing. I finished an entrepreneurship degree at Ryerson not too long ago, and I'm of a a young generation, and there's a lot of this that seems to be the new way of thinking. So some of it is from profit to purpose, from hierarchy to networks, from controlling to empowering, from planning to experimentation, and from privacy to transparency. And I can say, firsthand, from design thinking to the general way you go about starting a business now, that all of that makes a lot more sense. And that if you're going to be working on projects in organizations now, that there's a lot more project work as opposed to general repetitive nature of tasks. It's not standardized anymore. It's, you have to learn what works, as opposed to being told, here's what your job is. That a lot of, like, I think that really captures quite well the changes that organizations now have to face on how do you actually get those teams to function well.
Yes, that's correct. And what fascinates me is that very few individuals see what happens around them. They do have a clue what is relevant in the context, and they keep on, let's say, believing in simplification, believing in one right solution, which is not there in the VUCA world we live in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, there's a couple other, there's things that came to mind when I was looking at your description of Industry 4.0. And, one of them for me is integration as a general trend. And so I look around, I mean, there's a company that's working in the financial markets to try to do predictive analytics. And what seems to be their power is that they're able to bring in people from applied history, from economics, psychology, from all these different fields. And that, to me, points to the need for networks. I work in a network of consultants. So we have different skills, different experiences, and approaches, and we work together based on the problem. I mean, you look at IDEO in California, they do innovative solution design thinking and stuff like that. And it's, all of it seems to be moving away from not always top down. Like, you need a group of people together to get something done. And so
that's correct. And they often say that teamwork is a real competitive advantage. But the question is, why doesn't it happen more?
Yeah.
We all believe that teamwork is crucial for success, but nevertheless, it rarely happens. And that's the starting point of my book. Answering the question, well, how can we let it happen?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And then there's another thing that I thought was interesting, which is when you're looking at the difference between controlling and empowering and that type of stuff, it looks to me like you need to separate out the idea of sort of a power hierarchy and the idea of something like a competence hierarchy, or if there's going to be leaders at all in an organization, they need to be able to not necessarily be there just because they have power or dominance in some way, but they're there because they're able to add context to the work, or they're able to help lead the team in a very particular way.
Yeah, that's correct. And in fact, there are multiple dimensions in being a leader. There is the ability of, painting the bigger context and the emerging changes and the interdependencies and the potential tensions, and how those tensions could be coordinated. That's what I call the cognitive aspect and domain. Mm-hmm. But there is also the social emotional one, which means from what do I interpret reality from myself, or from the other perspective, and what in the other perspective do I take into account? Am I seeing people as instrumental for my own needs, and so acting a bit in a manipulative way? Or am I really able to act from a values perspective or a purpose perspective, a perspective that transcends individual differences? Yeah. And then we talk about the social emotional maturity phase in which a leader is. Authentic leadership is often described from the social emotional perspective of having entered in the self-authoring phase.
Yeah.
And you know, the essential finding is that very few leaders are aware in which phase of development, from which phase of development they interpret reality.
Yeah.
And so they often operate at different wavelengths, which causes a lot of communication and dialogue problems.
Yeah. Well, and you get to this, I think one of the central things, and it's a thing I've been thinking a lot about lately, is the importance of dialogue, and that there's you can't just say let's communicate better and try to learn specific communication skills, that there's a deeper level of awareness and understanding that needs to go into that.
Yes, indeed. It starts with an awareness of where are you, how, what's the foundation of your own interpretative scheme. But it will always go over the building the awareness of how do differences in developmental level play a role in how we work together as a team. You know, each team is composed of people that are developmentally mixed. You have a higher and lower developed people in a team, and the definition of higher and lower depends a bit on what's the real team challenge, what's the real issue at hand in the team. If a team operates brilliantly in the continuous improvement domain, it will not necessarily function in the rethinking business model domain. Mm-hmm. So how people influence each other and in what way the higher developed part of the team is able to pull the lower developed people above their level is crucial and determines real team outcomes. It creates a kind of an upward or a downward dynamic, and that's the very new issue that we try to describe in our book.
Yeah.
I think nobody has described team functioning and team dynamics from differences in developmental levels amongst the team members.
Yeah. Can you give an example of one of each type, so one of a downward and upward team, and sort of how that looks in person?
Well, for example, a team we all know very well is focused on continuous improvement. In that team, one is often focused on the improvement of sub-processes. And what's characteristic in those teams is that they work with downloaded models provided by consultants, models they have read in books, models that are derived from best practices in other organizations. And often they miss to see how their own context is different from the context in which the model has been developed. Like, for example, a lean model does not apply to many continuous improvement contexts as it was developed in Toyota, for example. And what then happens is that there starts a discussion on that quickly degrades towards a right-wrong discussion, or towards how can we simplify this further, or can we agree on the definitions, please? So all the ambiguity is pushed out of the team, which is very characteristic for downwardly oriented teams. That means that the less developed people try to hostage the higher developed ones, simplifying reality to such a level that it doesn't fit anymore to solve the problem and the issue. And the problem becomes even more complex in a second type of teams, which I call the rethinking value stream teams. That's a different team dialogue and what I call a different we space teams functioning in. In rethinking value streams, people from different specializations or units come together. For example, logistics with client teams, with production teams, with financial colleagues, and so on. And what happens in those teams is that each team member has already gone through a process of optimizing and differentiation in his or her own environment. So the power of the own logic is so big that it becomes even more difficult to transcend the different perspectives and individual logics. So if in end-to-end value stream teams, one logic starts to become the dominant logic, for example, the customer intimacy approach from the marketing and sales department, well, what you often see is that the other perspectives are pushed to the background, and at the end you get a very inefficient and not working throughput process in your organization, which is also a characteristic of the downwardly oriented teams in that environment. Upwardly divided team dynamics will succeed in transcending those different perspectives, and you will need different thinking exercises and introduce cognitive diversity in a different way. This can be done in a wide variety of ways. For example, in changing the feedback mechanisms so that one gets a real understanding of the perspective of the other. It can be done through thinking exercises. It can be done through what I call making explicit the job two we all have, and starting to build a kind of a meta vocabularium that enables a dialogue on giving feedback on how one works together, even enabling feedback around well, how one approaches issues, how one gets stuck in the own perspective, and the different biases that appear in teams.
Yeah.
And then you're able to really build an upward dynamic in a team when you're able to do that.
Yeah, there's a...
That makes sense what I'm saying.
Yes, and there's a lot of thoughts that go through my head. One of them, I mean, I can see a lot of Robert Keegan's work in here. And one of the things I took from him, I think it was in an everyone culture, was when you're talking about the feedback mechanisms, I thought the fishbowl example was really interesting. And so it gets back to your whole idea of when you're talking about the two jobs. So you have the job of, feedback and dialogue for, are you doing your work properly? Is the work getting done? But then there's a whole nother aspect of that, which is job two of making sure that you're developing your capability to, and so there's the social maturity level, and there's I'd say the cognitive piece, but it's a longer term developmental feedback. So it's not just, are you doing your job right, but how are you contributing to the team? How are you interpreting the world? And that, that I have a hypothesis I'd like to run by you. So I've been doing some work with Nick Foster of 1 Degree Shift, and we've been doing work on culture in organizations. And he uses Barrett's value hierarchy, which is a continuation of Maslow's work. And it's been useful in changing cultures in our work. And one of the things that the hierarchy talks about is so it goes from survival upwards to eventually sort of continuous improvement. Transformation is sort of the middle, and it goes up to making meaning and eventually up to sort of service. And I have a hypothesis that there's a lot of people, and this is held up for the people I've asked in my generation, especially when I was at school, of what are you looking for? What do you want in a job? And it seems to me that there's a shift in what people find valuable. They're less likely to move away from friends and family to work. They're more likely to look for work that they're going to be better after they took the job or the project. So they're looking for that job two work of development. And so that fits in with the model you're suggesting is how you might actually do that.
Yeah, that's correct. And the problem is a bit that many people wonder what kind of job fits their own profile.
Yeah.
But very few people are aware what their profile is and what they are becoming, in what process of development they're in.
Mm-hmm.
And so they often choose jobs on the basis of what they felt as being comfortable and good in the past,
Yeah.
but not the kind of job that enables them really to grow and to develop their full potential. That's a kind of a logic that is yet to be discovered by a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so if they are hungry to develop job two, there is even there a risk that job two is interpreted in a narrow way according to their own developmental level, according to what they already see or not see as being valuable for themselves.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if you ran across this. My grandfather and my grandmother, they wrote a book called Smart Creative. And part of the book, it was mostly based on the complexity component of Elliot Jack's work, which is different levels of complexity of information processing. And when they looked at Keegan's maturity levels, they seemed that it mapped pretty well on that, in that when you move into a self-authoring phase, that you're able to, it looks like you're at serial. You're no longer, if you use a subject-object distinction, you're subject at level two to either the processes that are already happening, or if you're talking about maturity level, you're subject to the sort of what the team's wanting to do. It's more on a continuous improvement level. But when you get to three, you're able to make your own opinions of things. You're able to do sort of a root cause analysis. And so I don't think it's that. I think it's maybe necessary but not sufficient in terms of having the cognitive development in order to do some of the social maturity development. What do you think of that?
Well, in a lot of cases, they co-vary and they co-evolve, but not in all cases. For example, the United States has a president which can perhaps be intelligent and function on a pretty high level, but is social emotionally not developed at all. So they can co-vary, but you need to be able to make the distinction in order to study how they co-evolve and what happens when they do not co-evolve. So late adult development is much more complex than looking at it from one dimension or one angle. You can look at it from the social emotional perspective, you can look at it from the cognitive perspective, but you can also look at it from, for example, the spiritual perspective. There are plenty of perspectives which co-vary, and what is still unknown is how one dimension influences the development of the other dimension and vice versa. For example, in my experience, I have seen that the cognitive development does not necessarily push social emotional development and vice versa. So we need models that enable us to look in a more specific way at reality. For example, if you build leadership programs and build a talent management system based on one dimension, whether it is only the social emotional dimension, you miss big parts of the reality, and you do not succeed in developing the full potential of people.
I agree with that. I mean, in my family's experience in consulting, it's when we're looking at development, it's a combination of, we've used the word maturity, and I think that is social emotional. We also use awareness of certain personality types, so the Enneagram, habits of attention, or Jungian stuff. But there's this whole dynamic of awareness of one's impact on other people and the way one is in the world. And I think Keegan's stuff's quite good. I haven't got into it as much. And we also use the cognitive, and we look at skills, knowledge, experience as another piece, but it's less, I think, less salient on the overall development piece. It's more of a supporting role. But the idea is that, you know, if you're strong in one and not strong in the others, you're going to run into trouble. So it's about trying to get them to grow at a similar enough level.
There's indeed a challenge of getting the dimensions aligned. And what I would like to add to the previous thought is that you made a reference to Elliot Jack.
Mm-hmm.
When he talked about the cognitive, he mainly talked about logical, analytical thinking and systems thinking, but he missed a bit the transformational thinking dimension, which is more dialectic of nature and has been described only during the last 10 years in literature.
Mm.
So even that dimension becomes more and more rich depending on the progress of scientific research.
Yeah, and I'm a little less familiar with exactly what you mean by the transformational, but from what I saw in your work so far, there was an aspect of it to me that if you're looking at Jack's stuff as the analytical is sort of at the concrete level, level 3, maybe a bit lower, you get into the system at 4, but to me the transformational stuff looked like 6 and up, where you're having to deal with variables that aren't there, or ambiguities that aren't there, and you're able to manage that. But I don't, yeah, and it may be a fair criticism. You didn't directly get into that, but I think from at least my grandfather's experience with dealing with people at all these different levels is that generally when you get to the really high levels, there's that transformational element where they're looking at disturbances in context and process and relationships and stuff like that.
Yes, that's true. And I do not doubt that a number of people at those higher levels are aware of how they cope with reality that is not yet there. Transformational thinking is about how you deal with and how you anticipate this equilibrium and are able to point to the potential of coordinating systems, mm-hmm. which has been pointed to by Elliot Jack, but has not been described by him.
Yeah.
At least not in the stuff that I have read about him.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. There's another interesting piece. I wonder what you think about this. There's been research on the Flynn effect generally with IQ, and so it looks like the IQ is going up about 3% a decade. And if you're able to sort of map that onto the complexity of information processing piece, then what my grandfather called was the talent upshift, where you're getting people who are coming out of school now a lot more at 3, and they're going into a workforce for jobs at level 2. And there's this big, and a part of the pain is that you don't have the language or the understanding to know why you're so frustrated at work. Mm-hmm. But to me, there's an opportunity here for a developmental organization to really attract talent by saying, look, we'll give you a very strong job too, and not just look at the cognitive piece, but we think that you have some of the social emotional aspects that we could help you along because you're more primed by being maybe at a higher cognitive level. And yeah, I don't know. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's correct. It's certainly a challenge for organizations to review their recruitment and selection processes, but it starts with how they conceive work and how the relationships between roles are designed. Something most organizations are not very good at. They look at work in terms of individual jobs, one besides one another. And they rarely ask the question of the value add that needs to be realized in jobs and jobs in relationships with each other. So there is an absence of a systemic way of conceiving and designing jobs. And there, the frustration of a lot of young people start, because given the development your grandfather pointed to, they quickly see that the system as a system does not work. So companies need to look for a different way of designing roles. And what I propose in my book is to describe roles through stories and use a kind of a story matching methodology, by which I mean that you can describe roles in terms of their unique value add on 5 dimensions, the unique value add in the domain of client and stakeholders. From this follows the unique difference one needs to make in the innovation domain.
Mm-hmm.
From that follows what kind of resources you can liberate, you can have or not have. And from that follows the kind of planning and organization, resulting in a number of outcomes and key indicators that need to be clear. What I often see is that functions are described in terms of activities and lists of activities. And that practice, well, makes it difficult to get roles aligned and see what kind of complexity handling is necessary from the individual. So both companies there miss the methods to innovate, and individuals are not aware of the kind of story they want to make a difference in. And the storytelling and the story matching methodology enables them to do so. It's a methodology developed in the IT domain, starting with user stories, and is now quickly moving into the human capital domain. And it's one of the entrance points to really review part of your human capital system in order to build a deliberate developmental organization.
Mm-hmm. And can you give an example of what a role would sound like then if you're using this new method?
Well, I can give plenty of examples, but I'm choosing one that enables you to make the difference. For example, if you have a customer contact center collaborator, traditionally, these are people that need to answer calls for clients in a qualitative way. And they use scripts and procedures to do that. Through Industry 4.0 developments, 40 to 50% of their activity gets automated, and clients are able to find the answers on their questions and even book appointments through the e-applications and the apps they can find on their mobile phones. So they only contact the contact center for more complex questions. Mm-hmm. Now the question raises, what is the key unique value of a contact center colleague? It's not anymore giving the most qualitative answer to the client. It becomes starting to look into optimizing the sub-processes in order to get the more complex the more complex questions answered for that client. And so the kind of innovation in the past was innovating in how do we address and ask questions, for example, to the client to clarify his or her issue. But now it becomes, well, looking into how can we improve the front office process or the back office process, which is a much more complex issue. So becoming clear about what kind of story is linked to that role is crucial to attract the right people. And then you can go further. what are the kind of resources that you have, and then you can come to the insight that in the new situation, the resources are not within the authority of the contact center collaborator, but of a team lead. And so you need to delegate those resources in order to get a good decision making. And then there is the planning. The planning will be a planning not on coping with daily issues and getting all the calls handled, but it will be about planning how to handle the calls on a daily basis, plus balancing with the time needed to review certain key processes.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds to me, at least this specific example is a raising of complexity of the work itself. But then what you're doing with the method is explaining that to people so that it becomes a more appealing piece.
You can explain that to people, and you can use the stories. Usually a story has about 10 sentences, not more. You can use those stories through social media, and people connect with the stories that describe the complexity they can handle, and they do not connect with stories which are either too simple or too complex. So you have a kind of a self-selection mechanism.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
It speeds up the quality of your selection.
yeah, that does. I mean, a lot of the experience I've had, at least working with the complexity stuff, is there's often a natural, I don't know if it's an intuition, but people generally are able to when you give words to what they're trying. What if you give words to describing the complexity issues? They say, "Yeah, I knew that. I couldn't say it." But a lot of the times, people self-select into the right roles or understand when there's a manager that's not at a high enough level to give them context, but not a too high level to sort of lose them in the clouds. And so I can see the new way of describing the roles. I mean, from my experience looking at organizations, is there's a lot of, they talk about the tasks you're doing, but it's sometimes hard to read in what you actually do on the job. And through the story method, it to me seems to communicate much more clearly what the complexity is.
Yes, indeed. And for example, if you're clear towards that customer contact center team member, that the outcome that he needs to realize is the increase of the conversion ratio, which is the number of calls which are, well, which you succeed in getting into a contract and to an invoicing. Well, you open a whole space of initiative and engagement for that person.
Yeah.
And through integrating that in the storyline, well, it becomes much more clearer what the challenge is and how that role creates a meaningful difference.
Yeah.
And that's really what engages people.
Yeah. I'm a lot of my peers, when they left the entrepreneurship program, there's a lot of them that went into, I mean, there's Uber Eats and other companies around, but they go in and it's getting chewed out and not necessarily seeing a direct impact. Most of them are handling sales calls or some sort of customer success management roles. But it's quite disengaging, and they're not given the resources and complexity and narrative of what they could be doing that would actually maybe match what they could do and be much more fulfilling.
Yeah, that's true. And once roles are clear and the role relationships are clear, well, then job two becomes much more easier to develop too.
Yeah. Well, and there's another aspect I'd bring into this of one of the hypotheses that my grandparents and I have talked about in terms of managing the talent upshift is sort of a mode peer group. And so the idea, mode is the estimate of the probabilistic estimate of where you're going to come out on complexity by the age of 70 is the measure. But if you can put people who are maybe at different levels right now but are on the sort of same path, that really there's a connection that happens, so they can understand each other even if they're not operating at the same level. And it's been my experience that the people who are farther along do a great job at helping the more junior person develop both on the maturity level and on the complexity level. And so the idea of having mechanisms and clear rules, all that, but mechanisms for developing strong teams, that you can do this across different levels of development. And if you can get that right, that there's a great chance of much more engagement from people who, are coming in with a high cognitive capacity, but don't have the knowledge, skills, and experience, or necessarily the maturity to do the work right away.
Well, I can see that, but there is one big but. It's not always the case. It doesn't always happen. What happens if somebody is on an intellectual growth path, but the social emotional dimension doesn't follow? So it will create a downward spiral in such a mode group, and learning will not happen.
Yeah.
What you're describing is the dynamic happening in an upward group.
Mm-hmm.
My experience in top leadership development teaches me that it only happens in about 30-35% of the groups.
Mm-hmm.
So there is still a big unknown area of not simultaneous development of the different developmental dimensions for which one's interpretation of reality changes. And the assumption that you're making is that the ones that are higher developed succeed in pulling the lower developed colleagues along with them up in an upward spiral, which is, often an idealistic view of what really happens.
Yeah, I can see. I guess I'm speaking from my experience, and I happen to be fortunate enough to be around people who look like they're much more in the upward divided team dynamic. Mm-hmm. But would you say you've been in applying the mechanisms that you're using? What's your success rate at moving people from sort of one type of team to the other? Have you been able to track that?
Well, I've been working with this since 2004, and most of my client trajectories last between 2 and 4 years that I can follow up development of people.
Yeah.
I'm also working with my students on really following up how senior managers develop. I'm teaching in the MBA program, and the average age of my students is between 30 and 40. And they often are already member of a management team and in a kind of a development path towards CEO-ship.
Yeah.
What I see is that in contexts where there is no support available, 6 out of 7 do not succeed. Nevertheless, they have the individual resources to invest in their own development. When you look at companies providing the enabling environment and even giving individuals budgets, I see quite a difference where companies invest in what I label as the vertical dimension, which is also supporting dialogue on the cognitive, the social, emotional, and even the spiritual dimension, versus companies who have a more unidimensional skills and competency approach.
Yeah.
In the latter, 6 out of 7 leaders really do not make it. And in the first context, well, you see the number of failures decreasing by about 20-25%, but still a lot of people do not make it.
Mm-hmm.
And what what explains that for me is that there is still a focus on systemic and logical analytical thinking. The dialectical thinking and the real transformational thinking dimension has not yet been discovered in a lot of companies. And by transformational thinking, I mean creating awareness on the kind of thinking structures that one uses to make sense of absences, the absence of information, but also the absence of context and the layers in the context, or the absence of insight in trends and emerging changes, how patterns of evolutions co-evolve or do not co-evolve, an absence of seeing real interrelationships and non-linearity in things that happen. So complexity theory focuses the attention on sub-thinking structures, and a lot of those structures are experienced in companies as being too abstract and not being simple enough to cope with their reality. And that's a kind of a, well, vicious circle. By pushing away complexity, they do not succeed in developing leaders that can handle the evolving higher complexity out there.
Mm-hmm. And so how would somebody, like, how would an organization start to take into account much more of the transformational thinking? What would be their steps to do that?
Well, I'm working on 3 dimensions simultaneously, and I call it a kind of a choreography approach. Companies need to think more in terms of iterative processes, processes influencing one another, and that you cannot plan transformational change, but you can stand still and go slower in order to go faster.
Yeah.
So what I'm often including in my approach are thinking experiments. And design thinking provided the basis to do that. They created a kind of a ground floor to quickly check whether something can work out or not, whether an idea could be viable or not. Well, I'm not approaching design thinking from a content point of view in terms of looking what could work, but I'm using design thinking experiments to invite people to start thinking on how they made sense about that experiment, how they engaged in different hypotheses simultaneously, how much context they took into account, how they made sense of different processes, emergence, co-evolvement, codependence, how they made sense of interdependencies, path dependence, and so on. So I'm a bit using the thinking experiments to help them both improve the quality of thinking of the issues they are tackling, at the same time improving their own thinking process and the quality of dialogue. And it's through letting them experience that a different quality of dialogue is, well, has much more impact, that you can develop one's thinking and invite somebody to start thinking when he or she is in the car, for example, about his or her own thinking processes.
Mm-hmm.
When you succeed in doing that, you have made a huge step forward in the development, because it's my parents always said to me, they have a small company, and they said, Jan, don't you see the work out there? I had to work very young. Well, it's a question of starting to see how you think, and that will enable you to develop a different range, a different set of competencies too.
Yeah.
You will then become much more successful as a leader or as an entrepreneur.
So, is your approach generally to go in with your client organization and facilitate these exercises, basically to get awareness around the types of processes that are going on, and try to sort of kick them into a developmental step? And then, like, how does that look? Do you do that for a couple of times with a group, and what's your duration for that?
The entrance point is mostly a business need, a business need and an evolving business model. So the top is aware that how they operate, that they won't be able to continue doing things as they always did.
Yeah.
And there is already an awareness that in order to implement the new strategy, they will need a different structural setup. And that creates the ground to start questioning how teams could be composed and what kind of redesign in roles are necessary. Once the redesign of roles starts, one becomes conscious about new types of meeting structures, governance structures. And it is in that context that I introduce the thinking experiments.
Mm.
So I never come in with a toolkit. Say, well, you have these projects running. Well, I can help you to improve the quality of thinking of what you're already doing, because in that kind of situation, I risk a lot of being thrown out. Who am I to start saying that the quality of dialogue is not fit for purpose? No, it starts on a higher level, the awareness of a need to transform the business.
Mm.
And that a kind of a company-wide transformation process is necessary, and that the quality of dialogue will be a crucial ingredient to do that. And the quality of dialogue can only be changed when you start changing, let's say, the purpose of jobs and roles. When you are able to engage people in a reflection process on how they will need to collaborate in a more intelligent way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Does that resonate?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, most of the consulting jobs I've been involved on are similar in that they start from some sort of specific pain point around transformation, or trying to grapple with industry 4.0 is mostly what's happening, and then we have various different some of it's role for clarification, some of it's cultural surveys and workshops to figure out what the transformation needs to look like before then we move into how the solution might be. Like, there's a lot of the problem finding activities before you end up doing the solution. You don't come in with the solution.
No, that's correct.
Yeah. So can you talk a bit about, you had a piece on collaborative intelligence and sort of the 4 ingredients that you have. Can you talk about that for a bit?
Well, the essential insight there is that in each team you have the development of trust. There is an issue of mobilization of resources and initiative, and there is an issue of coordination. And trust, co-mobilization and coordination are determined by the developmental differences in the network or in the teams you're in. That means you only trust people who are on an equal developmental level. And you have distrust in people that are too far away from your own developmental level. And you will only commit to organized action if you have a feeling that at least a certain percentage of your colleagues is also willing to step in the change process. And that assessment or that evaluation depends on the developmental phase you're in too. So creating an awareness of developmental differences is very crucial. In fact, you could even argue that one is able to mobilize large groups of people when they share the same developmental level. And if you look at social media and how groups are formed on social media, you often see that Facebook and many other network platforms, that people organize themselves around people who share the same way of interpretation of reality. And that's how, well, social dynamics evolve. And it also explains why social change is so difficult. If you have addressed certain social groups in, for example, an election procedure by very simple language, well, you need to continue to use that simple language in order to ensure yourself of their commitment, their lasting commitment. And so it's very difficult to, well, to get things changed. Does it resonate?
Yeah, that does. What do you, so when you're, if you're either a business leader or if you're going in as a helping hand, a consultant, what's your mechanism for identifying the levels of maturity that people are operating at? Is it possible for a business leader to pick up those skills?
It is, and well, I'm giving them a simple trick to do that. What I advise them to do is start talking about an issue that is very relevant to their partner, to the one they want to assess, and follow a kind of a three-step approach in terms of, well, for example, if you start talking about what does success mean for you, or what does taking a stance mean for you, or what does risk-taking mean for you. So you select a theme and you simply start the dialogue asking, what does that mean for you? And then, can you give me an example? And when the example is given, then there are two more steps to go. The first one is, what made it so important for you now to come to that result? And the last step is then asking the question, and for whom was that now a success or not? And depending on that answer, they can answer, well, it was a success for my client, or for my lobby group, or for my employees. So you will quickly sense whether they find it important to comply with somebody else or a group, or whether it follows an own conviction system. And when you're then aware of the big phases of development, from instrumental, which means that you see others as an instrument to fulfill your own needs, or other dependent, which means that basically you want to get the respect of others, towards self-altering, which means that you're operating from your own vision,
yep.
Towards self-aware, which means that you start to see others as, in a very humble way, as those who can help in your own development. So there is always a shift from me to the other. And depending on the kind of tension or conflict the other has woven into the story that he or she shares, you can quickly pinpoint the correct developmental maturity level of somebody.
Good. Yeah. And in your experience, that's easy enough to pick up as a leader. Like when you're walking people through this, they'll go and be able to do that on other people after you're gone?
Well, often when I see students back after 5-6 years, and I ask them, what is it that you have taken with you and that you still apply? They often make reference to their insight in how people develop in the social emotional domain and in the cognitive domain. That's something they often always started working with, and help them to improve their own team dynamics.
So what would be your sort of one takeaway you'd want a leader of a business today to take away from this conversation and your book? What's your central point?
Well, the central point is you can only build great teams if you are aware of developmental differences in teams, and if you're able to influence them through introducing either cognitive diversity and or start working and sharing developmental phases social emotionally.
Good. Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you. If people want to learn more about this, I believe your book's on your website at connecttransform.be.
That's correct.
And is there anything else you'd like to plug here where they can find out more about what you're up to?
Well, there is also a masterclass that I'm organizing, and that can be adapted to specific needs of companies. Also, the content of that masterclass, which goes through the essentials of dynamic collaboration, is available on my website.